The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Grove Lane as 14-year-old Jamal Williams adjusted his basketball under his arm. His coach would give him an earful for being late to practice again, but that was tomorrow's problem. Right now, his attention was fixed on the hunched figure at the end of the street. An elderly man with wispy white hair struggled to lift a pile of chopped wood onto a small cart. His weathered hands trembled with each attempt, and even from a distance, Jamal could see the pain etched across his face. The man paused, leaning against a nearby tree to catch his breath, his shoulders heaving with exertion. Jamal hesitated. Coach Taylor had warned him about tardiness, and another missed practice might cost him his starting position. But something about the old man's determined yet futile efforts tugged at his conscience. "Hey, mister. Need some help with that?" Jamal called out, jogging toward the elderly man. The old man straightened abruptly, suspicion darkening his features. He squinted at Jamal, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his age. "I didn't ask for any help," he replied gruffly, his voice like gravel. "I've been carrying my own wood for 50 years. Jamal slowed his approach, keeping a respectful distance. "Yes, sir. I can see that. Just thought an extra pair of hands might make it go faster, that's all." The old man, Harold Winters, though Jamal didn't know his name yet, studied the boy carefully. His gaze lingered on Jamal's basketball jersey, the worn sneakers, and finally settled on his face. "You one of the Thompson kids from over on Maple?" Harold asked, his tone still wary. "No, sir. I'm Jamal Williams. My family moved into the Blue House on Sycamore last summer." Jamal pointed vaguely in the direction of his home. "I was heading to the court for some practice when I saw you with all this wood." Harold's eyes narrowed. "Practice, huh? Shouldn't you be there instead of bothering an old man?" Jamal shrugged, offering a small smile. "Coach always says helping others is more important than a jump shot. Besides, I can practice any time." A hint of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps reluctant approval, flickered across Harold's face before the scowl returned. "Well, if you're so determined to help, I suppose you can take the smaller pieces." He gestured toward the pile. "The cart needs to go to the backyard. Think you can manage that without dropping everything?" "Yes, sir, I can manage," Jamal replied, setting his basketball safely aside and rolling up his sleeves. The wood was heavier than it looked, each piece dense with the scent of pine and oak. Jamal worked steadily, organizing the logs by size before loading them onto the cart. He noticed Harold watching him, those blue eyes tracking his every move as if expecting him to steal something or suddenly run off. "You don't need to stack them so neatly," Harold commented after a while. "They're just going to be burned. My dad always says anything worth doing is worth doing, right?" Jamal responded, not pausing in his work. "Even if it's just stacking firewood." Harold made a noncommittal sound, but Jamal caught the slight nod of approval. As they worked, Jamal took in the details of Harold's property. The small, well-maintained cottage sat back from the road, partially hidden by ancient oak trees. Unlike the other homes on the street, there were no holiday decorations, no welcome mat, nothing to suggest the owner wanted visitors. A workshop stood behind the main house, its windows clouded with dust but the structure itself sound. Everything about the place spoke of solitude. "You live here alone, sir?" Jamal asked, immediately regretting the personal question when Harold's expression closed off. "That's not really your business, is it, boy?" Harold replied, his tone sharp. "Sorry, sir. Didn't mean to pry." They worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds being the thud of wood against wood and the occasional creak of the cart's wheels. Eventually, they had loaded all the firewood, and Jamal waited for instructions. "Follow me," Harold said curtly, taking hold of the cart's handle. Jamal noticed the old man's hand shaking with the effort and gently intervened. "I can pull it, sir. Just show me where it goes." For a moment, it seemed Harold would refuse, pride battling practicality. Finally, he released his grip on the handle with a resigned sigh. "Around back, next to the workshop. There's a covered area for keeping it dry." As they rounded the cottage, Jamal saw the workshop up close for the first time. Despite its dusty windows, he could make out the silhouettes of various tools and what looked like furniture in different stages of completion. His curiosity piqued, but he remained focused on the task at hand. The wood storage area was nearly empty, with just a few logs remaining from what must have been last season's supply. Jamal carefully unloaded the cart, maintaining the organization he'd established. "You planning on a cold winter, sir?" Jamal asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. Harold, who had been watching from a nearby stump, rubbed his knee absently. Winter's always cold when you get to be my age, boy. Blood gets thin. Bones start to ache. There was something in the way he said it, not seeking pity, just stating a fact that made Jamal look at him more closely. The man's clothes, though clean, were worn thin in places. His boots had been patched multiple times. The house itself, while tidy, showed signs of deferred maintenance that Jamal's father would never have allowed. I could help you collect more wood before winter really sets in, Jamal offered impulsively. There's a lot of fallen branches in the woods behind the school. Good, dry stuff that would burn real nice. Harold stared at him, genuine confusion crossing his weathered face. Why would you do that? The question was so straightforward, so devoid of the adult pretense Jamal was accustomed to, that caught him off guard. He considered his answer carefully. Honestly, because it seems like you could use the help, and I've got time. My dad always says a community is only as strong as the connections between neighbors. Your father sounds like quite the philosopher, Harold remarked dryly. Jamal grinned. He's a high school history teacher. Can't help himself sometimes. A ghost of a smile flickered across Harold's face before vanishing. He pushed himself to his feet with visible effort, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a worn leather wallet. Well, I suppose I should pay you for your trouble, he began, but Jamal was already shaking his head. No need for that, mister. Jamal realized he still didn't know the man's name. Winters. Harold Winters. No need for that, Mr. Winters. I wasn't looking to get paid. Harold's eyebrows rose slightly. Everyone wants something, boy. Jamal, he corrected gently. And maybe I just wanted to help. My grandpa always said good deeds come back around eventually. Your grandpa and your dad seem to have a lot of sayings between them, Harold observed, his tone less sharp than before. He studied Jamal for a long moment before nodding slowly. Well, Jamal, I appreciate the assistance today, but don't feel obligated to make a habit of it. I managed on my own for quite some time. There was pride in those words, but also a trace of something else, loneliness, perhaps, or resignation. Jamal couldn't quite place it, but he recognized it as the same tone his grandmother had used in her final years, insisting she didn't need help even as her strength failed her. Of course, Mr. Winters. But if I happen to be passing by again and you're working on something, I might stop and lend a hand. If that's all right with you. Harold made a non-committal sound that wasn't quite agreement but wasn't a refusal either. He walked Jamal back to the front of the house, moving slowly but with determined steps. As Jamal retrieved his basketball from where he'd left it, he noticed several neighbors watching from their porches or windows. An older woman across the street quickly ducked inside when she realized he'd spotted her. A man walking his dog deliberately crossed to the other side of the street, giving Harold's property a wide berth. Harold noticed, too. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his expression impassive as he watched the neighbors' reactions. People in this town don't have enough to keep them busy, he muttered finally. Always watching, always whispering. Jamal bounced his basketball once, considering. My mom says people fear what they don't understand. Your family's full of wise sayings, aren't they? Harold replied, but there was less bite to his sarcasm now. You better get to that practice of yours before it gets dark. Jamal nodded, taking a few steps backward. I'll see you around, Mr. Winters. I expect you will, Harold replied, and though his expression remained stern, his voice had lost some of its edge. He turned and walked back toward his cottage, his gait stiff but determined. As Jamal jogged away, he glanced back once to see Harold standing on his porch, watching him go. The old man raised his hand in what might have been a wave before disappearing inside, closing the door firmly behind him. Jamal continued toward the basketball court, but his mind was no longer on his crossover dribble or his free throw technique. Instead, he found himself wondering about Harold Winters, about the workshop behind his house, about why the neighbors seemed afraid of him, and about why a man who'd clearly been strong once was now struggling alone with tasks that were becoming too much for him. One thing was certain, despite Harold's gruff demeanor and obvious desire for solitude, Jamal would be back. Something told him the old man needed more than just help with firewood, even if he'd never admit it. As the sun dipped lower, casting the street in golden light, Jamal made a silent promise to himself. He would return tomorrow, and the day after that if necessary. Some instinct told him that beneath Mr. Winters' prickly exterior lay a story worth discovering, and Jamal had always loved a good story. Little did he know that this chance encounter on a quiet autumn afternoon would change the course of both their lives in ways neither could possibly imagine. The next afternoon, Harold Winters was raking fallen leaves when he spotted a familiar figure approaching his property. Jamal Williams walked with purpose, his school backpack slung over one shoulder and a paper bag clutched in his hand. Harold straightened, leaning on his rake with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Back again? Thought yesterday was a one-time good deed. Jamal smiled, undeterred by the old man's gruff greeting. Afternoon, Mr. Winters. My mom always makes too many cookies on Tuesdays. Thought you might like some. He extended the paper bag. Harold eyed the offering warily before accepting it with hesitant hands. Your mother sends cookies to strangers? Told her about helping you yesterday. She said anyone who needs help with firewood probably needs homemade cookies too. Jamal glanced at the yard. Need help with those leaves? Before Harold could refuse, Jamal had already set down his backpack and picked up a spare rake leaning against the porch. I don't recall asking for a gardener, Harold grumbled, but with less conviction than the day before. Not a gardener, just a neighbor, Jamal replied easily, beginning to rake. Besides, homework can wait an hour. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythmic scraping of rakes against earth creating an unexpected harmony. Harold occasionally stole glances at the young man, his weathered face unreadable. Your parents know you're spending time with an old man instead of friends? Harold finally asked. Jamal shrugged. Dad says character is built through service to others. Mom says I should respect my elders. He paused. Also, basketball season doesn't start for 2 weeks, so my afternoons are pretty free. Harold made a non-committal sound, but Jamal noticed his rake moving a little less stiffly, his posture a little less guarded. As they finished gathering leaves into bags, Harold hesitated before speaking again. I've got some lemonade inside. Store-bought, nothing fancy. If you're thirsty. The invitation, reluctant as it was, represented a significant shift. Jamal accepted with a nod, following Harold into the cottage. Inside, the home was immaculately clean but sparse. Few personal items adorned the walls or surfaces. The furniture was simple but beautifully crafted, each piece showing signs of expert woodworking. Did you make all this furniture? Jamal asked, running his hand along the smooth edge of a cherry-wood dining table. Harold set 2 glasses of lemonade down. Every piece. Been a carpenter since I was 16. It's amazing work, sir, Jamal said sincerely, noticing the way Harold's eyes brightened at the compliment. Used to run my own shop in town, Harold continued, something in Jamal's genuine admiration loosening his usual reticence. Winters Fine Furniture. Closed it 15 years ago when my wife passed. I'm sorry about your wife, Jamal said quietly. Harold nodded once, acknowledging the sympathy without dwelling on it. Still keep my hand in Outback. Workshop's not what it used to be, but it passes the time. As Jamal sipped his lemonade, he noticed a small photograph partially hidden behind a clock, the only personal item visible in the room. A much younger Harold stood beside a beautiful woman with a warm smile, both standing proudly in front of a storefront. That your shop? Jamal asked, gesturing toward the photo. Harold followed his gaze, his expression softening momentarily. Opening day, 1972. Eleanor insisted on the picture. Said we needed to document our beginning. She had a nice smile, Jamal observed. The best, Harold agreed, a rare warmth in his voice. Then, as if catching himself revealing too much, he cleared his throat. Better get those leaf bags to the curb before the city workers complain. Days turned into weeks as Jamal's visits became a daily ritual. He'd arrive after school, sometimes staying for 20 minutes, other times for hours. Harold gradually revealed more of himself, stories of his carpentry business, techniques he'd mastered, clients he'd worked for. One rainy afternoon, unable to work in the yard, Harold hesitantly invited Jamal into his workshop. The space was filled with tools, wood in various stages of processing, and half-completed projects covered in drop cloths. This is incredible, Jamal breathed, taking in the organized chaos of a master craftsman's domain. Harold ran his hand along a lathe, wiping away a thin layer of dust. Hasn't seen much use lately. These old hands aren't as steady as they once were. Jamal noticed a beautiful rocking chair in the corner, nearly finished but missing its final coat of stain. Did you make that? Started it 4 months ago. Can't seem to finish it. Harold's voice carried a note of frustration. Eyes aren't what they used to be, and my fingers cramp up after an hour or so. Jamal approached the chair, admiring the intricate joinery. My grandfather used to say that beautiful things take time. Maybe it's just waiting for the right moment to be completed. Harold studied Jamal thoughtfully. You ever worked with wood, boy? No, sir. Always wanted to learn, though. A silence fell between them, heavy with possibility. Finally, Harold reached for a small block of pine and a whittling knife. Here, he said, extending them toward Jamal. Start simple. A cube, then maybe a sphere. Wood's forgiving if you respect its grain. That first lesson turned into another, then another. Harold proved to be a patient teacher, guiding Jamal's hands without taking over, explaining techniques with clarity born from decades of experience. As October gave way to November, word spread through the neighborhood about Jamal's daily visits to Old Man Winter's place. The whispers reached Jamal's ears at school. Heard you're hanging out with that weird hermit on Pine Grove, said Tyler, a classmate, during lunch. My mom says he's dangerous. That he ran his wife off and she disappeared. Jamal set down his sandwich. His wife died 15 years ago. He closed his furniture business because he was grieving. Tyler shrugged. Whatever, man. Mrs. Daniels across the street says he shouts at night sometimes. And nobody's been inside that house in years. I have, Jamal replied simply. He makes the best lemonade and teaches me woodworking. You shouldn't believe everything you hear. The rumors persisted, but Jamal ignored them, his bond with Harold growing stronger each day. He began to understand the old man's reclusiveness, not born of malice or secrets, but profound loss and the simple desire to be left alone with his memories. One afternoon, as Jamal carefully sanded a small jewelry box he was making under Harold's guidance, the old man brought out a worn leather-bound ledger. Been thinking, Harold said, his voice unusually hesitant. You mentioned wanting to go to college someday. Jamal nodded. Hope to study architecture or maybe engineering. Still figuring it out. Costs money, college does, Harold continued, opening the ledger. My Eleanor kept our books. Always put aside a little, even in lean times. He paused. Thing is, nobody to leave it to when I'm gone. Jamal set down his sandpaper. Mr. Winters. Let me finish, boy, Harold interrupted gently. Not saying I'm dying tomorrow, but I'm 72 with a bad heart and worse knees. Been thinking about what happens to all this. He gestured around the workshop. When I'm not here anymore. I'm sure you have family somewhere who... No. The word was soft but final. Eleanor and I couldn't have children. My brother passed 10 years ago. His kids never visit. Harold's weathered fingers traced the columns of numbers in the ledger. What I'm saying is, might be nice to see this old place and what's in it go to someone who'd appreciate it. The implication hung in the air between them, too significant for either to acknowledge directly. You've got years ahead of you, Mr. Winters, Jamal said finally. And I've still got a lot to learn about woodworking. Harold closed the ledger with a nod, a small smile tugging at his lips. That you do. Now show me how that jewelry box is coming along. As winter approached, bringing early snow flurries and bitter winds, their routine continued. Jamal split his time between basketball practice, schoolwork, and hours in Harold's workshop. The old man's health seemed to improve with the company, his movements more fluid, his smile appearing more frequently. Until the day Jamal arrived to find Harold's front door standing open, a neighbor frantically on the phone with emergency services, and Harold collapsed on his kitchen floor. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the sterile room as Jamal sat beside Harold's bed. 3 days had passed since the ambulance had rushed the old man to Pine Grove Community Hospital. 3 days of worried waiting, of hushed conversations with doctors, a holding vigil in uncomfortable chairs. You don't have to stay, boy, Harold muttered, his voice weaker than Jamal had ever heard it. Got better things to do than watch an old man sleep. Jamal looked up from his textbook. Studying here or studying at home doesn't make much difference to me, Mr. Winters. Harold's pale blue eyes found Jamal's. Stubborn, just like Eleanor was. A nurse entered, checking Harold's vitals with practiced efficiency. Your grandson's been here every day, she remarked kindly. You're lucky to have such a devoted family. Neither Jamal nor Harold corrected her assumption. When she left, a heavy silence settled between them. Heart attack, Harold finally said, gesturing weakly at his chest. Doctor says it was coming for years. Says I'm lucky to be alive. You're going to be fine, Jamal insisted, though the doctors had been far less optimistic in their private conversations with him. Harold's laugh was dry and without humor. We both know that's not true. But I appreciate the sentiment. He shifted slightly, wincing with the effort. Been thinking about what happens next. You focus on getting better, Jamal replied. I've been keeping an eye on your place. Brought in the mail, fed that stray cat that hangs around. Ginger, Harold supplied unexpectedly. Eleanor named her years ago. Different cats, same color. His eyes drifted to the window. Listen, Jamal. There's something I need you to do. The use of his first name, or rarity from Harold, caught Jamal's attention. In my workshop, under the main workbench, there's a metal box. Keys taped to the underside of the third drawer in my bedroom dresser. Harold's words came slowly, each one deliberate. Need you to get it and bring it to me. Don't open it. Just bring it here. Jamal nodded, sensing the importance behind the request. I'll go right after school tomorrow. Thank you, Harold said, the simple gratitude carrying the weight of all the unspoken words between them. The next day, Jamal followed Harold's instructions precisely. In the workshop that had become a second home to him over the past months, he located the metal box, heavier than expected and locked tight. True to Harold's word, the key was exactly where he'd said it would be. As Jamal prepared to leave, metal box tucked carefully in his backpack, he noticed Mrs. Daniels watching from across the street. She made no attempt to hide her surveillance, arms crossed disapprovingly. Afternoon, Mrs. Daniels, Jamal called out politely. The woman's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. Does your mother know you're rummaging around in that old man's house while he's in the hospital? Doesn't seem proper. Jamal kept his voice even, though anger flickered through him. Mr. Winters asked me to bring him something from his workshop. He's been teaching me carpentry for months now. That's so. Mrs. Daniels replied skeptically. Well, I've lived across from Harold Winters for 20 years, and I've never seen him teach anyone anything. Man barely speaks 10 words a year. Maybe you never gave him a reason to speak to you, Jamal suggested, his patience wearing thin. Mr. Winters has plenty to say if you take the time to listen. Mrs. Daniels' eyes narrowed. Your mother should be careful about who you spend time with. There are rumors about that man. Rumors aren't facts, ma'am, Jamal interrupted, his father's lessons on respect warring with his desire to defend Harold. Mr. Winters is a master carpenter who lost his wife and his business. He's not dangerous or crazy. He's just been alone too long. Not waiting for her response, Jamal turned and walked away, the weight of the metal box a reminder of the trust Harold had placed in him. At the hospital, Harold was sitting up, though his complexion remained ashen. His eyes brightened slightly when Jamal entered with the box. You found it, he said, motioning for Jamal to bring it closer. With shaking hands, Harold inserted the key and opened the lid. Inside lay several documents, a small velvet pouch, and an envelope with Jamal's name written on it in careful script. Wasn't sure I'd ever share this with anyone, Harold admitted, removing the envelope. But life has a way of making decisions for us sometimes. He extended the envelope toward Jamal. This is for you. Not for now, for later. After. Jamal hesitated. After what, Mr. Winters? After I'm gone, Harold replied simply. Which, according to Dr. Phillips, might be sooner rather than later. He placed the envelope in Jamal's hand. Promise me you won't open it until then. I promise, Jamal whispered, throat tight with emotion. But you're going to be fine. You'll be back in your workshop before Christmas. Harold's smile was gentle, knowing, maybe so. But as December arrived with swirling snow and holiday lights, Harold's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer that had been silently spreading through his body for years, undetected until his heart attack forced a full examination, was aggressive and untreatable. Jamal split his time between school, basketball practice, and the hospital. He brought small woodworking projects to Harold's bedside, working while they talked or sat in comfortable silence. On good days, Harold would offer advice or tell stories of furniture he'd built decades ago. On bad days, Jamal would simply read aloud from woodworking magazines, Harold's labored breathing the only indication he was still listening. Word of Harold's condition spread through the neighborhood, but few visitors came. Jamal's parents stopped by occasionally, bringing food and offering support. Mrs. Daniels sent a card but didn't visit. The nurses grew accustomed to seeing Jamal there, sometimes bringing him dinner when his homework stretched into the evening hours. A week before Christmas, Harold took a turn for the worse. Jamal was pulled from his history class to be told the news. By the time he reached the hospital, Harold was drifting in and out of consciousness. "You came," Harold murmured when he opened his eyes to find Jamal beside him. "Of course I came," Jamal replied, fighting back tears. "We still have that rocking chair to finish, remember?" Harold's laugh turned into a cough. "You'll finish it. You've learned enough." His breathing was labored, each word an effort. "The envelope. Remember." "I remember," Jamal assured him. "But you're going to be okay. You have to be." Harold's hand found Jamal's, his grip surprisingly strong. "Been alone a long time. Forgot what it was like having someone care whether I woke up each morning." His eyes, though clouded with pain, held Jamal steadily. "Thank you for that. For reminding me." 2 days later, with Jamal and his parents at his bedside, Harold Winters took his final breath. The hospital room fell silent save for the single, continuous tone of the heart monitor and Jamal's quiet sobs. The funeral was small, just Jamal, his family, a handful of nurses who had cared for Harold, and surprisingly, Mrs. Daniels. The pastor spoke generically about a life well lived, having never actually met the deceased. As they stood beside the grave, watching Harold's simple casket being lowered into the earth next to Eleanor's, a tall man in an expensive suit approached Jamal. "Jamal Williams?" the man inquired. When Jamal nodded, he continued, "I'm Thomas Blackwood, Mr. Winters' attorney. He asked me to speak with you after the service." Confusion and grief mingled on Jamal's face. "You were his lawyer for over 40 years, Mr. Blackwood confirmed. Harold was a very private man, but he was also methodical about his affairs." He glanced around. "Perhaps we could speak somewhere more private?" "Your parents are welcome to join us, of course." 20 minutes later, they sat in a conference room at Blackwood's downtown office. The lawyer placed a thick folder on the table. "Mr. Winters came to see me approximately 3 months ago," Blackwood began. "He wanted to update his will. Said he'd met someone who had changed his perspective." His eyes rested briefly on Jamal. Harold had no living relatives, no one he considered family. His estate, while modest by some standards, is quite substantial. Jamal's father leaned forward. "I'm not sure I understand why we're here, Mr. Blackwood." The lawyer opened the folder. "Harold Winters has left his entire estate to your son. The house, the workshop, and all its contents, a savings account, and several investments Eleanor had insisted on years ago." He slid a document across the table. "The total value is approximately $350,000. Stunned silence filled the room. Jamal's mother gasped softly. "There must be some mistake," Jamal's father finally managed. "No mistake," Blackwood assured them. Harold was very clear. He also left specific instructions that the funds be used for Jamal's education and to maintain the workshop. The lawyer handed Jamal a smaller envelope. "He asked me to give you this as well." With trembling hands, Jamal opened it. Inside was a single key, the key to Harold's workshop, and a note in the old man's careful handwriting. "Jamal, some debts can never be repaid. You gave an old man friendship when he'd forgotten its value. The house is yours, the workshop yours, the savings yours. But the most valuable thing I can leave you is purpose. In the metal box you brought me, you'll find designs for furniture I never built. Dreams I never fulfilled. They're yours now. Build them. Sell them. Use the money for college, then come back and teach others what I taught you. That's how you'll repay me, by not letting what I know die with me. Harold." Tears streamed down Jamal's face as he read the words aloud. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the unopened envelope Harold had given him at the hospital. Inside was a deed to the property, already transferred to Jamal's name, an old photograph of Harold and Eleanor standing proudly in front of their furniture shop. Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. Harold's final request was that you look in the back of his workshop under the tarp in the far corner. He said you'd understand its significance." Later that evening, Jamal stood in Harold's, now his workshop. With reverent hands, he pulled away the tarp in the corner, revealing the rocking chair they'd never finished together. Beside it stood another chair smaller, clearly sized for a child. Taped to the second chair was a yellowed envelope. Inside, a faded hospital report from 1980 and a photograph of a nursery furniture set Harold had built, a set never used. The medical report detailed Eleanor's third miscarriage, their final attempt at having a child. Understanding washed over Jamal like a wave. Harold hadn't just been teaching him woodworking. He'd been giving him the legacy he'd never been able to pass to a child of his own. 5 years later, the sign outside the renovated storefront read, Winters and Williams Fine Furniture. Inside, Jamal, now a college graduate with a degree in business, worked alongside 3 apprentices from the local high school. The walls displayed photographs. Harold and Eleanor on opening day of the original shop, Jamal with Harold in the hospital, and Jamal cutting the ribbon on the new store. In the front window stood a rocking chair, Harold's final design, completed by Jamal's hands. A small plaque beneath it read, To Harold Winters, who taught me that the most valuable things we build are not made of wood, but of kindness. And each winter, Jamal would visit Harold's grave with a piece of wood from that season's projects. A tradition to honor the unexpected legacy that began with one simple act, a young boy helping an old man carry wood.